In the summer of 1944, the front between Finland and the Soviet Union formed a long arc from the Gulf of Finland through the Karelian Isthmus and East Karelia to the tundra of Lapland. For almost 2 years, this line had been relatively static. Finnish forces, supported in the north by German 20th Mountain Army, held trench systems and field fortifications while the Soviet Leningrad and Karelian fronts contained them with limited offensives and artillery duels. To understand why the Soviet leadership decided to launch a major operation here in June 1944, the story has to return to the Winter War of 1939 to 1940. That conflict ended with the Moscow Peace Treaty, which forced Finland to cede the Karelian Isthmus, including Viipuri, parts of Ladoga Karelia and Salla, and to lease a naval base at Hanko. Roughly 11% of Finnish pre-war territory and more than 10% of its population were transferred to the Soviet Union. For many in Finland, the peace of 1940 was seen as a temporary, imposed settlement. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941, Finnish leaders framed their participation as a continuation war aimed primarily at recovering the 1940 losses and pushing the front farther from key cities. Finnish forces advanced beyond the old border, reoccupying Viipuri and reaching the Svir River and the outskirts of Petrozavodsk, while German troops in Lapland operated toward Murmansk and the Arctic sea routes. By late 1942, that offensive phase was over. The Soviet Union stabilized the front and concentrated on larger operations against Germany further south. Around Leningrad, however, the threat from the Finnish side remained politically sensitive. The lifting of the siege in January 1944, during the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive, pushed German forces away from the city. But Finnish positions on the Karelian Isthmus still lay within artillery range of the urban and industrial area. For the Soviet leadership, securing Leningrad and the approaches to the Gulf of Finland remained a strategic priority. At the same time, the overall balance of the war was changing. On the Eastern Front, Germany was under pressure from successive Soviet offensives, and in the West, the Allied landing in Normandy was imminent. Finland, with a population of about 3.7 million, had mobilized an army whose strength reached about 650,000 by June 1944, but the country depended on German deliveries for fuel, munitions, and grain. War weariness increased after 3 large Soviet air raids on Helsinki in February 1944, in which more than 2,000 bombers dropped over 16,000 bombs, killing around 146 people and destroying or damaging hundreds of buildings, despite extensive air defences. Politically, Finnish leaders had already explored ways out of the war. In 1943 and early 1944, representatives sounded out peace terms via Sweden and other intermediaries. The Soviet Union demanded acceptance of the 1940 borders with additional concessions, war reparations, and the severing of ties with Germany. For President Risto Ryti and Commander-in-Chief Carl Gustaf Mannerheim, these demands appeared close to unconditional, and negotiations stalled. Finland continued to fight as a German co-belligerent, but kept diplomatic channels open, hoping for more favourable conditions later. In Moscow, Stalin and the Stavka assessed Finland in a wider strategic framework. With major summer offensives planned against Germany in Belarus and Ukraine, they wanted to remove the risk that German and Finnish forces together could threaten Leningrad, Murmansk, or the Murmansk Railway, and to free Soviet formations for use elsewhere once the Northern Front was secured. Planning for the Vyborg-Petrozavodsk operation therefore combined military aims, pushing the front beyond the Karelian Isthmus and East Karelia, with a political objective: to demonstrate that the Red Army could break Finnish defences and place the Finnish heartland under direct threat, thereby compelling Helsinki to accept Soviet armistice terms. On the ground, the two sides prepared in different ways. The Finnish High Command built a series of defensive belts on the isthmus: the front line, the VT line farther back, and behind them the VKT line anchored on Vyborg, Kupasari and the Vuoksi River ridges. Much of this system, especially the deeper positions, remained incomplete by mid-1944. Finnish field forces on the isthmus initially numbered about 75,000 men, later reinforced to roughly 268,000 across the isthmus and East Karelia, with around 110 tanks or assault guns and fewer than 250 operational aircraft. Opposite them, the Soviet Leningrad and Karelian fronts assembled a much larger grouping. By June 1944, they deployed about 451,500 soldiers, more than 10,000 guns and mortars, around 800 tanks and self-propelled guns, and roughly 1,600 aircraft. This numerical advantage was intended to ensure that, once the offensive began, Soviet forces could achieve a decisive breakthrough quickly enough to influence Finnish political calculations, before German reinforcements or international diplomacy could significantly alter the situation. At dawn on 10th June 1944, the relative quiet of the Karelian Isthmus ended. Along a sector roughly 20 to 25 kilometers wide, Soviet artillery units of the Leningrad front opened a planned fire program against Finnish first-line positions. More than 3,000 guns and mortars, supported by Guards mortar regiments with multiple rocket launchers, fired on trenches, command posts, artillery batteries, and road junctions. The bombardment lasted several hours in phases: counter-battery fire, destruction fire against strong points, then a rolling barrage in front of the infantry assault. Overhead, aircraft from the 13th Air Army and Baltic Fleet Aviation targeted crossroads, reserves and coastal batteries, while naval guns from the Gulf of Finland engaged coastal sectors. The ground assault in this opening phase was led by the 21st Army under Colonel General Dmitry Gusev, deployed between the Gulf of Finland and the Vuoksi Lake system. Its main shock group consisted of several rifle corps supported by tank brigades and breakthrough artillery divisions, organized to achieve a density of dozens of guns per kilometer on key axes. South of the main thrust, elements of the Baltic Fleet prepared for possible amphibious actions against islands and the coastal flank. The operational goal in this first stage was to rupture the Finnish frontline defences, seize the terrain between the border and the VT line, and open the way toward Viipuri. On the Finnish side, the sector facing the main attack was held by 4th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Taavetti Latikainen, with several infantry divisions and supporting units distributed along the front in depth. The first defensive belt, based on pre-war border positions and field fortifications around localities such as Valkeasaari, was manned by regiments of the 10th and 2nd Divisions. Finnish artillery, although fewer in number, attempted to answer the Soviet fire with counter-battery missions and defensive barrages, but many batteries had limited ammunition stocks and had to ration shells carefully. Forward observation posts reported heavy concentrations on known strongpoints and junctions, indicating that Soviet reconnaissance had mapped the positions in detail. As Soviet infantry advanced behind the last lines of the barrage, Finnish front units reported breaches in wire obstacles and communication trenches destroyed. In several places, the first Soviet waves were halted or pushed back by machine gun fire and local counterattacks, but infiltration through forested and marshy gaps created pressure on company and battalion flanks. The limited number of Finnish anti-tank guns on the line, many of them older 45mm or captured pieces, had difficulty engaging Soviet medium tanks at longer ranges. Radio traffic in Finnish Corps and division headquarters reflected growing concern about the integrity of the forward positions already on the first day. During 11 and 12 June, the opening phase continued as a rolling process of local breakthroughs and withdrawals. Soviet units expanded bridgeheads through captured trench systems, brought up artillery and anti-tank guns, and pushed reconnaissance elements toward the VT line. The Leningrad front staff monitored progress and adjusted the axis of main effort according to resistance, allocating additional artillery groups and tank support to sectors where the Finnish line appeared close to giving way. For the Red Army's soldiers taking part, the early days of the offensive combined heavy firepower support with difficult assaults over forested ground, minefields, and dug-in positions that had been prepared over several years. For Finnish soldiers in the forward battalions, the opening phase meant a rapid shift from routine trench duty to continuous combat, often under artillery fire that exceeded anything seen previously on this front. The destruction of field telephone lines forced many units to rely on runners and signal flares, complicating coordinated counterattacks. Civilians in nearby rural areas began to leave as artillery and air attacks reached villages behind the front, and as military authorities organised evacuations along the roads leading north and west. In Helsinki and other Finnish cities, initial reports were succinct and often delayed. But the scale and direction of the Soviet attack soon became clear to both the military and political leadership, framing the next decisions about reinforcement, withdrawals, and requests for external support. Behind the artillery and infantry now engaged on the Karelian Isthmus stood a set of calculations formed months earlier in Moscow and Helsinki. For the Soviet leadership, the Vyborg-Petrozavodsk operation was designed as a time-limited campaign that had to fit into the wider 1944 sequence of offensives. Stavka orders defined the main task of the Leningrad front as breaking through Finnish positions on the isthmus, capturing Viipuri, and advancing toward the Kymi River line, while the Karelian front would strike in East Karelia toward Petrozavodsk and Sortavala. The intention was to push the front away from Leningrad, cut Finnish forces on two axes, and create a direct military threat to southern Finland, including the routes to Helsinki and Turku. Stalin and his advisors did not require a complete occupation of Finland to reach their political objective. Intelligence from diplomatic channels and radio intercepts indicated that Finnish decision-makers were already divided between continuing the war and seeking an armistice. The offensive was therefore planned as a demonstration of capacity. If Soviet forces could breach successive defensive lines, seize major cities such as Viipuri and Petrozavodsk, and show that further advances were feasible, the Finnish government would face a choice between negotiating on Soviet terms or risking deeper penetration into the country. To support this concept, planners on the Leningrad front concentrated resources in a way that had not previously been available on this theatre. Rail lines from the interior brought ammunition, fuel, and engineering materials into depots around Leningrad and the isthmus towns. Artillery units were grouped into breakthrough divisions with pre-assigned fire missions down to regimental level. Engineer battalions prepared bridging equipment, mine-clearing devices and assault boats for river crossings and canal sectors. Air forces received clear priorities: establish air superiority over the isthmus, disrupt Finnish reserves and supply routes, and support ground forces at key moments, rather than dispersing sorties along the entire front. Operational planning also included deception measures. While obvious troop concentrations on the isthmus could not be hidden completely, efforts were made to maintain activity in other sectors so that Finnish intelligence would have to distribute attention. Radio traffic was managed to avoid revealing the exact timing of the assault, and reconnaissance flights mapped Finnish lines while posing as routine missions. On the Karelian front, preparations for later attacks reinforced the impression that Soviet interests might be focused on East Karelia rather than primarily on the isthmus. In Helsinki and at Finnish headquarters in Mikkeli, strategic goals were more limited but complex. Mannerheim and the general headquarters sought to preserve the army and maintain a defensible line long enough to secure political room for manoeuvre. The defensive system on the isthmus was designed to absorb and slow down a Soviet offensive in stages. First the front line, then the VT line, and finally the VKT line running through Viipuri, the ridges near Tali and Ihantala, and the Vuoksi River. If these positions could be held, Finnish leaders hoped to demonstrate that their country remained a difficult target, strengthening their hand in any future negotiations. Finnish planners, however, were constrained by manpower, equipment, and supply. The field army had already fought for several years with limited industrial backing. Artillery ammunition stocks were calculated in days at high expenditure rates. Armoured strength centred on the Armoured Division, with German-supplied Stug 3 assault guns and a smaller number of Panzer IVs, supplemented by older tanks. The Air Force operated a mixed fleet of Bf-10-9s and earlier fighter types, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft, but in smaller numbers than the Soviet air units opposite them. Logistically, the main supply lines from the interior to the isthmus ran along a few railways and roads that were vulnerable to air attack. Intelligence estimates in Finland correctly identified a growing Soviet buildup on the isthmus during spring 1944, but assessments varied on whether this would lead to a limited local offensive or a larger campaign aimed at forcing Finland out of the war. Some officers argued that the main Soviet effort would remain directed against Germany further south, with only secondary operations in the north. Others warned that the concentration opposite Fourth Corps indicated a more serious intention. The Finnish government, balancing between dependence on German deliveries and a desire to keep options open with the Soviet Union, hesitated to draw conclusions that would either commit the country irrevocably to Berlin or to early, possibly unfavourable armistice terms. German involvement formed another layer in Finnish planning. By early 1944, German authorities had made clear that large ground forces could not be spared for Finland, but they could offer aircraft, anti-aircraft guns, and additional weapons if Finland pledged to remain in the war. Negotiations about future deliveries and the role of German air units in Finland continued into June 1944, intersecting with the opening phase of the Soviet offensive. For Finnish commanders on the isthmus, expectations of German air and material support became part of their calculations about how long they could hold successive lines once the main Soviet attack began. On June 10th, the main weight of the Leningrad front fell on the Finnish positions around Valkeasaari. The sector was held by the 1st Infantry Regiment of the Finnish 10th Division, deployed in concrete bunkers, trenches, and dugouts constructed over several years. The pre-war fortifications, however, had not been fully modernised, and some positions lacked overhead cover against heavy shells. After the preparatory bombardment, Soviet infantry from the 30th Guards Rifle Corps advanced behind tanks and self-propelled guns, exploiting breaks in the wire and minefields. By evening, parts of the Finnish first line had been overrun, bunkers destroyed or isolated, and several companies forced to withdraw to avoid encirclement. On 11th June, Finnish commanders attempted to restore the situation with local counterattacks. Reserve battalions from the 10th and 2nd Divisions were committed piecemeal, supported by the limited number of anti-tank guns still functioning and by artillery batteries firing at maximum rate within ammunition limits. In some sectors, these counterattacks regained lost trench sections or delayed Soviet units for several hours, but the overall direction of the front could not be reversed. Soviet forces continued to widen the breakthrough, bringing up fresh regiments and additional armour through the captured positions. The collapse of the forward line had immediate territorial and operational consequences. Finnish units fell back toward the VT line, the first of the deeper belts intended to form the main defensive zone. Withdrawal had to be conducted under continuous artillery and air attack, with roads congested by guns, supply columns and field hospitals. Rear echelons attempted to destroy dumps and installations that could not be evacuated. For the local civilian population, the renewed retreat meant a second displacement in 4 years. Families that had returned to the isthmus after 1941 now packed belongings again and moved toward the interior, escorted or directed by military authorities. In the Soviet ranks, the initial success at Valkeasaari reinforced confidence in the plan. Reports from 21st Army headquarters noted that Finnish resistance in the first line had been overcome more quickly than some estimates had predicted, although individual strongpoints held out. Commanders requested further artillery support, bridging equipment, and engineer units to keep pace with the retreating enemy. On the broader front, neighbouring Soviet formations advanced in step to prevent the Finns from forming a continuous new line between the breakthrough area and Lake Ladoga. By 13th June, lead elements of the Leningrad front reached the VT line near Kuta-Selka and other key localities. This belt, running from Vamalsuu on the Gulf of Finland to Taipale on the shore of Lake Ladoga, consisted of field fortifications and partly completed bunkers linked by obstacles and anti-tank ditches. Finnish reinforcements, including the armoured division and formations transferred from quieter sectors, moved into the area to man these positions. The aim was to stabilise the front here, using the more favourable terrain and prepared lines to absorb the Soviet momentum. The first engagements on the VT line quickly revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Finnish position. In some sectors, such as Siiränmäki, Finnish infantry supported by newly arrived German-supplied close-range anti-tank weapons managed to blunt Soviet attacks and hold the line. In others, Soviet rifle divisions and tank brigades achieved local penetrations, using concentrated artillery fire and coordinated infantry armoured assaults to overwhelm strongpoints. The pressure on IV Corps' command structure increased as commanders tried to plug gaps with the few remaining reserves. For the soldiers of both sides, the first week of the offensive was characterised by continuous movement and repeated assaults. Soviet riflemen advanced through forest, swamp, and shattered fortifications, often under counterfire from well-concealed positions. Finnish troops shifted from fixed trench warfare to fighting withdrawals and improvised blocking positions. Casualty clearing stations on both sides filled rapidly with wounded from artillery and small arms fire, while medical units worked close to the front to return lightly wounded men to their units as soon as possible. Morale was tested in different ways. Among Finnish units, news of the loss of the front line and the rapid Soviet advance caused concern, but the existence of the VT and VKT lines and the arrival of reinforcements offered a concrete framework for continued resistance. Among Soviet troops, the visible breach of the long-standing frontier positions near Leningrad underlined that a new phase of the war in the north had begun, and that their actions might influence political decisions in Helsinki. As the fighting shifted fully onto the VT line, both commands prepared for a larger trial of strength that would determine whether the Soviet breakthrough could be translated into deeper penetration toward Viipuri and the Vuoksi, or whether the Finnish defence could re-establish a stable, defensible front. The collapse of the VT line in mid-June marked a clear escalation of the campaign. Between 14 and 15 June, Soviet formations broke through near Kuta-Selka, where Finnish positions were manned by elements of the 3rd and 18th Divisions and hastily brought reserves. Despite local counterattacks supported by the Armoured Division and heavy artillery, the continuity of the VT line could not be restored. Gaps opened between strongpoints. Soviet rifle and tank units pushed into the rear areas, and the Finnish High Command ordered a general withdrawal toward the VKT line to avoid encirclement of entire divisions. The VKT line, running from Viipuri along the ridges near Tali and Ihantala to the Vuoksi River and Lake Ladoga, now became the focus of both sides. Finnish engineers, units of the Pioneer Battalion and local labour forces accelerated work on trenches, gun pits and anti-tank positions that had not been fully completed in earlier years. Field artillery was repositioned to cover likely avenues of approach along the main roads and rail lines. The Armoured Division, with its Stugi assault guns and Panzer Hy-Vs, was placed as a mobile reserve behind the most threatened sectors, while infantry divisions took over sectors along the ridges and riverbanks. For the Leningrad front, the fall of the VT line confirmed that the initial breakthrough could be turned into an operational advance. Additional rifle divisions, armour and artillery were moved forward, and staff planning increasingly focused on taking Viipuri quickly. The city, Finland's second-largest urban centre before the war and a major road and rail junction, lay only a short distance behind the new Finnish positions. Capturing it would not only provide a logistical hub for further operations toward the Kymi line, but would also have clear political implications, demonstrating to Helsinki that the Red Army could reach deep into southern Finland. On 19th and 20th June, Soviet units approached Viipuri from the east and southeast. The city's defense relied on a reduced garrison, primarily the 20th Brigade and separate battalions, backed by limited artillery and a small number of armoured vehicles. Many experienced Finnish formations were still taking up positions on the Tali and Ihantala ridges and along the Vuoksi. After preparatory bombardment and urban assaults, Soviet rifle units entered Viipuri on June 20th. Finnish forces withdrew toward the VKT line, destroying bridges and infrastructure where possible. The loss of the city created a continuous Soviet bridgehead west of the pre-war border and placed the new Finnish line under immediate pressure. News of Viipuri's fall and the speed of the Soviet advance produced a political and military crisis in Helsinki. Government meetings reviewed reports from the front and estimates from Mannerheim and his staff. There were discussions about whether the army could hold the VKT line with existing resources, and what a further Soviet advance toward Lahti, Kouvola, or even Helsinki would mean for the state's ability to continue the war. Some ministers argued that the situation required immediate approaches for peace. Others feared that any move without German support would leave Finland isolated and exposed to harsher Soviet demands. In this situation, relations with Germany intensified. German authorities, aware that a Finnish collapse would expose northern Norway and the Baltic operations, offered increased support in exchange for assurances that Finland would not seek a separate peace. Negotiations led to President Risto Ryti giving a personal commitment that Finland would not conclude an armistice while he remained in office in return for substantial deliveries of weapons and ammunition. This understanding, reached in late June, formed the political framework for a sharp rise in German military assistance. German support materialized quickly on the battlefield. An air group assembled from units in Northern Europe, known as Gefechtsverband Kuhl-Mai, deployed to Finnish airfields with dozens of fighter bombers and fighters to reinforce the Finnish Air Force along the isthmus. Shipments of anti-tank weapons, including thousands of Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck launchers, arrived for distribution to frontline infantry. Additional Stu-G assault guns were delivered to strengthen Finnish armoured and assault gun battalions. These measures did not remove the numerical superiority of the Leningrad front, but they increased the density of anti-tank and air defence resources along the VKT line at a critical moment. At the same time, the northern wing of the offensive expanded. The Karelian front opened its operations toward Petrozavodsk and the northern shore of Lake Ladoga, forcing Finnish forces in East Karelia into withdrawals from positions held since 1941. Towns and villages that had been administered by Finnish authorities for 3 years were evacuated, with both soldiers and civilians moving toward the old border. This dual pressure from the Isthmus and East Karelia strained the Finnish command's ability to allocate reserves and artillery. It also signalled that the Soviet aim was not a narrow local correction, but a broad advance back to and beyond the 1940 frontier. International observation of the crisis varied. German leaders viewed the fighting as a test of whether a northern partner could be kept in the war through material aid and political pressure. British and American diplomats monitored developments for signs that Finland might be separated from Germany, which would ease Allied maritime operations in the Baltic and the Arctic. In Moscow, Soviet decision-makers followed both military reports and diplomatic signals, aware that each kilometre gained on the isthmus and in Karelia altered the balance of options available to Helsinki. For Finnish civilians, escalation meant renewed evacuations from the Karelian Isthmus and East Karelia, air raid alarms in southern cities, and increasing shortages as transport routes were disrupted by air attacks. For Soviet civilians in the Leningrad region, the advance reduced the remaining Finnish artillery threat to their city and promised the restoration of pre-war borders. By the end of June, both societies understood that the campaign had entered a phase in which outcomes at the front could determine not only local territorial lines, but also the political future of Finland as a state within or outside the German war system. After the fall of Viipuri, the offensive entered its most intense phase. The Leningrad front reoriented its main effort against the VKT line, identifying the area between Tali and Ihantala as the key sector. Here, a corridor only a few kilometers wide lay between lakes and marshes, channeling any advance toward the interior road network. Soviet plans envisaged a concentrated blow in this sector. If the Finnish defense could be broken here, armored and mechanized units could move west toward Lappeenranta and north toward Jyväskylä, threatening to cut Finland in two. By late June, the Soviet grouping at Tali-Ihantala consisted of several rifle corps with attached tank brigades and self-propelled gun regiments, totaling roughly 50,000 to 70,000 men and more than 150 tanks and assault guns in the immediate area. The Finnish 4th Corps, with elements of the 3rd, 4th, 6th and 11th Divisions, and the Armoured Division, deployed around 25,000 to 30,000 men in the same sector, supported by over 200 field and heavy guns, and a growing number of German-supplied assault guns and anti-tank weapons. The geography allowed only limited manoeuvre, but made artillery and air power particularly important. The Battle of Tali-Ihantala began in earnest around 25th June. Soviet artillery again opened with concentrated fire on Finnish positions, followed by infantry and armour attacks along the roads and ridgelines. Finnish units responded with pre-planned fire zones, observation posts, and forward companies reported target coordinates to a central fire control system, which could bring dozens of batteries to bear on a single attacking formation. In several attacks, Soviet tanks and infantry advancing through narrow corridors came under simultaneous fire from multiple Finnish and German batteries, causing losses but not halting all assaults. Air operations over the sector reached a peak. The Finnish Air Force and Gefechtsverband Kuulme flew hundreds of sorties, using fighter bombers against Soviet tank concentrations, artillery positions, and bridges. Soviet air units, numerically superior, attempted to suppress Finnish batteries and to protect their own ground forces, leading to continuous engagements over the isthmus. Both sides claimed significant successes. In practice, air power functioned as an additional layer of attrition rather than a single decisive factor. On the ground, the fighting around Tali involved repeated Soviet efforts to expand local penetrations. In late June, Soviet units managed to push Finnish defenders back from some forward positions, creating salients and threatening to separate divisions. Countermeasures included bringing the armoured divisions Stojies and Panzer IV into close cooperation with infantry, deploying them from covered positions to engage Soviet armour at short range, often supported by concentrated artillery fire and Panzerfaust teams in the forests and villages. Several Soviet armoured thrusts were checked or forced to withdraw after losing vehicles to this layered defence. While Tali-Ihantala was absorbing major resources, another critical engagement developed on the Vuoksi River near Vuosalmi. From early July, Soviet forces sought to establish and expand bridgeheads on the western bank. Finnish units, including elements of the 2nd Division and supporting artillery, attempted to contain these crossings by shelling pontoon bridges, strongpoints, and assembly areas. Soviet troops succeeded in maintaining a foothold, but repeated attempts to break out from the bridgehead into the Finnish rear met coordinated resistance from infantry, artillery, and when weather allowed, air attacks. At the same time, the Karelian front continued its advance in East Karelia. Soviet forces captured Petrozavodsk on the 29th of June and pushed Finnish troops back toward the pre-war borderline and the so-called U-line positions. Finnish formations in this sector carried out fighting withdrawals, destroying infrastructure, and evacuating civilians and administration personnel who had lived under Finnish rule since 1941. The loss of East Karelian territory removed any remaining Finnish leverage connected to wartime gains beyond the 1940 frontier, but it also shortened the front and allowed some units eventually to be redeployed. Civilian suffering accompanied this peak phase on both sides. In the evacuation zones, Finnish civilians moved along congested roads under the threat of air attack, leaving farms, homes, and public buildings that had been rebuilt after the Winter War. In the Leningrad region, the continued advance of the front reduced the risk of Finnish artillery fire, but families still dealt with minefields, damaged infrastructure, and the long-term effects of the earlier siege. Medical services in both countries now treated a growing number of wounded and disabled veterans, placing additional strain on limited hospital capacity. High command decisions reflected the pressure of events. In Moscow, Stalin and the Stavka monitored reports from the Isthmus and Karelia, weighing requests for further reinforcements against the needs of major operations against Germany in Belarus and Poland. Orders to the Leningrad and Karelian fronts emphasized the goal of breaking Finnish resistance, but also instructed commanders to avoid excessive losses that might weaken Soviet capabilities elsewhere. In Finland, Mannerheim rotated exhausted units where possible, requested maximum concentration of artillery ammunition on the critical sectors, and communicated to the government that the army could continue to hold if the VKT line was maintained, but that its capacity for further prolonged retreat was limited. By early July, the campaign had reached a point where both sides had committed substantial resources on the Isthmus and in Karelia. Daily casualties ran into the hundreds for each army. Armoured losses accumulated, and ammunition expenditure for artillery and mortars reached levels that required careful rationing and resupply planning. The VKT line still held, but only under continuous effort. The Soviet offensive retained the initiative, yet its progress had slowed compared to the first days after 10th June. The outcome of the next weeks would determine whether the breakthrough could be renewed, or whether the front would harden into a line that neither side could easily shift. As July progressed, both sides adjusted methods to sustain operations along the VKT line and the WWII. For the Finnish command, resistance meant more than holding individual strongpoints. It required reorganization under fire. Divisions on the Isthmus were regrouped to create denser defensive clusters at decisive points, while less threatened sectors were thinned to free battalions and artillery batteries. Headquarters refined artillery fire control, integrating Finnish and German batteries into combined fire plans in which dozens of guns could be directed rapidly onto detected Soviet concentrations. New weapons altered battlefield practices. The widespread arrival of Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks led to revised infantry tactics, with small teams trained to engage Soviet armor from forest cover and village ruins at close range. Assault gun units were increasingly used in ambush roles rather than frontal counterattacks, emerging briefly from concealed positions, firing on tank columns or strongpoints, and withdrawing before Soviet artillery could respond. Engineers laid new minefields in front of and between positions, forcing attacking units into pre-sighted corridors. Adaptation also took place within the Soviet forces. The Leningrad front refined the coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery, shifting from broad frontal assaults to narrower, heavily supported attacks aimed at identified weak spots. Reconnaissance units, including ski troops and scouts familiar with forest operations, probed Finnish lines at night to locate gaps and adjust the direction of subsequent pushes. Artillery planners made increasing use of aerial observation where weather and air opposition allowed, correcting fire on headquarters, supply routes, and artillery positions behind the Finnish front. Logistics became a central concern. Finnish supply services worked to maintain deliveries of ammunition, fuel, and food over railways and roads that were under frequent air attack. Trains were run at night where possible, and stocks were dispersed in smaller dumps to reduce the effect of bombing. Field workshops repaired damaged guns and vehicles using salvaged parts, while medical services prioritized returning lightly wounded soldiers to their units in order to compensate for limited replacement manpower. Ration scales were adjusted in some sectors to reflect shortages, especially of imported foodstuffs. For Soviet logistics, the advance beyond the old border required bridging destroyed infrastructure and maintaining long supply lines through partly devastated terrain. Engineer units built and rebuilt pontoon bridges, corduroy roads and causeways across marshes and streams. Truck columns brought ammunition and fuel forward from depots around Leningrad and Ladoga, while rear services had to balance the needs of the Finnish front with demands from other active theatres. Maintenance units worked on tanks and self-propelled guns in improvised workshops close to the line to keep the armoured component of the offensive effective. Psychological adaptation affected both armies. Among Finnish soldiers, the knowledge that they were now fighting on pre-war national territory, often close to their own evacuated homes, reinforced a defensive motivation tied to concrete places. At the same time, fatigue from continuous combat, repeated withdrawals and casualties in small communities contributed to a growing sense of strain. Chaplains, medical officers, and company commanders dealt with issues of battle exhaustion using rest rotations where possible, though the tempo of operations left limited scope for extended relief. In the Soviet ranks, the offensive against Finland had a distinct character compared to the simultaneous operations against Germany. Soldiers received information about the political aims of the campaign, including references to the 1940 borders and the role of Finnish forces in the blockade of Leningrad. For some, the advance into areas previously lost in the Winter War represented a form of restitution. For others, it was one operation among several in a long sequence of offensives. Casualties sustained in repeated assaults around Tali, Ihantala and the WWII tested unit cohesion, but replacements from reserve formations helped maintain combat strength. The Finnish leadership also adapted at the political level. As frontline reports indicated that the VKT line was holding despite constant pressure, calculations in Helsinki began to shift from immediate survival toward the conditions under which an armistice might be negotiated. Mannerheim communicated to the government that the army could not sustain a further major retreat without losing its structure as an effective national force, but that if current positions were maintained, Finland would still be negotiating as a state with a functioning army rather than as a defeated territory. On the Soviet side, Stalin and the Stavka evaluated how much additional effort should be invested in attempts to break the VKT line compared to other fronts. Intelligence suggested that Finnish society and leadership were under significant strain, and that German capacity to increase support was limited by commitments elsewhere. This reinforced the original concept of the offensive as a demonstration. If the Red Army could show that it could penetrate to Viipuri, hold bridgeheads on the WWII, and push Finnish forces out of East Karelia, further incremental advances might not be necessary to achieve the political goal. Civilians continued to adapt to the demands of a country under pressure. In Finland, local administrations managed the reception of evacuees from Karelia, organizing temporary housing, ration cards and employment in regions unaffected by direct fighting. Agricultural production had to be maintained with reduced labor as many men remained at the front, leading to wider use of women and older workers in seasonal tasks. In the Soviet Union, communities around Leningrad and in recaptured Karelia began restoring roads, railways, and public services, even as mine clearance and reconstruction work proceeded close to the moving front line. By mid-July, resistance and adaptation on both sides had produced a new balance. The initial Soviet surge had been checked by layered Finnish defences supported by German material, while Soviet forces had shifted to methods that reduced unnecessary losses and emphasized artillery and limited attacks. The VKT line and the WWII positions remained under threat, but they had not broken. The offensive continued, yet its character shifted from rapid advance toward a campaign of pressure designed to influence decisions in Helsinki as much as to secure additional kilometers of ground. The decisive turning point of the Karelian offensive emerged gradually rather than in a single day. Militarily, it took shape in late June and early July on the ridges of Tali-Ihantala, the WWII crossings, and the U-line in East Karelia. Politically, it coalesced in Helsinki as leaders began to interpret the stabilizing front not as a final victory, but as a narrow window in which to seek an exit from the war before a renewed Soviet push. By early July, the major Soviet assaults against the VKT line had reached diminishing returns. In the Tali-Ihantala sector, successive attacks over the last week of June and the first days of July brought local penetrations but no lasting breach. Finnish and German sources later estimated that Finnish forces in this area suffered around 8,000 casualties, while Soviet losses were at least twice that number, though precise figures vary between archival reconstructions and post-war accounts. Repeated armoured thrusts were checked by coordinated artillery fire, assault guns, and close-range anti-tank weapons, turning the narrow corridor into a zone of attrition rather than rapid advance. On the WWII, the bridgehead at Vuosalmi became another focal point of the turning process. Soviet troops maintained a foothold on the western bank, and for some days it appeared that this position might be used as a springboard for a drive into the Finnish rear. Intensive Finnish artillery fire, counterattacks by infantry and armoured detachments, and continuous air activity restricted the expansion of the bridgehead. Casualties on both sides mounted, and the Soviet command had to decide whether further investment of forces at Vuosalmi would produce a decisive result, or merely extend the attritional patterns seen at Tali-Ihantala. In East Karelia, Soviet units advanced to and in places beyond the pre-war border, but Finnish withdrawals there were more controlled than the rapid retreats on the isthmus in mid-June. The Finnish U-line, although not impregnable, offered a shorter and more coherent front. As Soviet spearheads approached it, their supply lines stretched, and the operational payoff of further advances diminished relative to the resources required. The loss of Petrozavodsk and surrounding areas had already removed the political and territorial gains Finland had made east of Lake Ladoga. Pushing deeper would not significantly change the strategic picture if the main Finnish army remained intact. Within the Soviet command, this combination of factors influenced decision-making. The Stavka had launched the Vyborg Petrozavodsk operation with the dual purpose of securing Leningrad and exerting decisive pressure on Finland, but it was also preparing and conducting major offensives against Germany in Belarus, Ukraine, and later Poland. Reports from the Leningrad and Karelian fronts showed that the Finnish field army was still resisting in an organized fashion, and that further progress would require additional infantry, armor, and ammunition. In mid-July, orders increasingly emphasized consolidation of gained positions, improvement of defensive works, and artillery preparation, rather than continued attempts to break through at any cost. For Finnish commanders, the same set of developments appeared as a confirmation that the VKT line could be held if ammunition, replacements, and German deliveries continued for the time being. Operational reports to Mannerheim stressed that although units were exhausted and losses heavy, the line on the isthmus and along the WWII remained unbroken, and that Soviet attacks were decreasing in intensity. This did not remove the long-term strategic imbalance, but it altered the immediate calculus. Instead of preparing for another large-scale retreat, the general headquarters could begin to think in terms of managing a static front, while the political leadership sought a way out. In Helsinki, this shift fed directly into discussions about leadership and armistice. President Ritti's personal commitment to Germany had secured increased military aid at a critical moment, but it also restricted Finland's freedom of action. As the front stabilized, conversations among ministers and senior officials turned to the question of whether a change in the head of state might provide a basis for redefining Finland's position. Mannerheim, respected as commander-in-chief and regarded by some foreign observers as a potential negotiating figure, emerged as a central candidate. International signals reinforced the sense that a political turning point was possible. From German perspectives, the slowing of the Soviet advance in Finland offered some reassurance, but the broader strategic situation after the failures in Belarus and Normandy limited Berlin's capacity to dictate Finnish policy. Allied governments in London and Washington indicated that they would not oppose Finnish efforts to leave the war if these included ending cooperation with Germany and facilitating Allied operations in northern waters. Soviet diplomatic channels maintained that an armistice would require substantial concessions, but the fact that the front had stabilized and that Finland still fielded an organized army suggested that negotiations would occur with a government that retained internal authority. At the front, the practical signs of the turning point were subtle. Fewer large-scale attacks, more artillery duels, and increased attention to fortification and logistics on both sides. Soldiers noticed that offensives that had previously followed one another in rapid succession now gave way to longer periods of positional fighting. For Finnish units, this provided limited opportunities for rest and reorganization. For Soviet formations, it meant a shift from continuous forward movement to a mix of local operations and defensive duties along new lines that lay well beyond Leningrad and the 1940 frontier. By late July, the combination of a halted breakthrough effort, a still intact Finnish army on the VKT line, and evolving political calculations in Helsinki and Moscow had transformed the nature of the campaign. The original Soviet demonstration objective had largely been achieved. Viipuri and East Karelia were in Soviet hands, and the roads into southern Finland lay open in principle. The question was no longer whether the Red Army could penetrate Finnish defences further, but whether doing so was necessary to achieve the political goal of removing Finland from the war. This change in focus marked the core of the turning point, setting the stage for the final phase of withdrawals, negotiations, and the armistice that would follow. By late July, the tempo of fighting on the Karelian Isthmus and in East Karelia had slowed. Major Soviet assaults against the VKT line and the WWII crossings gave way to artillery exchanges, local probing attacks, and a gradual strengthening of defensive positions on both sides. Supply services rebuilt depots, laid new communication lines, and improved trench systems that only weeks earlier had been assembly areas for advancing troops. For many units, the daily pattern shifted from continuous offensive effort to a mixture of patrols, fortification work, and recovery from previous engagements. The Soviet command now assessed that its primary objectives had been reached. Leningrad was secure from Finnish artillery. Viipuri and most of the Karelian Isthmus were under Soviet control, and Finnish forces had been driven from East Karelia. Intelligence reports suggested that Finland was seeking a political solution, and that Germany's ability to reinforce the northern front was constrained by crises elsewhere. In early August, orders to the Leningrad and Karelian fronts increasingly stressed consolidation of the new front line and preparation of positions rather than further deep penetrations. On 9th August, the Vyborg-Petrozavodsk operation was formally concluded. For Finnish units, the end of large-scale Soviet attacks did not mean complete calm. Artillery fire, air raids, and small engagements continued. Patrols probed no man's land, and both sides maintained readiness in case the offensive resumed. However, the absence of new massive assaults on the VKT line and the WWII allowed some rotations from front positions, repair of weapons and fortifications, and a more systematic treatment of wounded and sick soldiers. The army remained mobilized, holding a shorter line that ran roughly along the 1940 frontier in Karelia and to the west of it on the isthmus. The political system in Helsinki moved in parallel with developments at the front. On August 1st, President Risto Ryti resigned, explaining in his letter that he considered his continued presence an obstacle to peace efforts because of his commitment to Germany. Parliament elected Carl Gustaf Mannerheim as president on August 4th, while he retained his role as commander-in-chief. This concentration of authority was intended to present the Soviet leadership with a negotiating partner. who embodied both political and military responsibility, and who was not personally bound by earlier assurances to Berlin. Under Mannerheim, the Finnish government renewed contacts through Sweden and other channels to explore Soviet terms. Messages from Moscow indicated that any armistice would require acceptance of the 1940 borders with additional concessions, war reparations, the lease of a naval base near Helsinki, and the breaking of relations with Germany. At the same time, German representatives pressed Finland to remain in the war, offering further deliveries of weapons and supplies, and warning of consequences if Finland concluded a separate peace. The Finnish leadership had to balance the risk of military collapse if the war continued against the political and economic costs of accepting Soviet conditions. The presence of German forces in northern Finland added a complicating factor. Approximately 200,000 soldiers of the German 20th Mountain Army were deployed in Lapland, controlling roads and ports vital for German operations in northern Norway and the Arctic sea lanes. Any Finnish armistice with the Soviet Union would require an end to cooperation with these forces and, as Soviet demands became clearer, their disarmament or expulsion from Finnish territory. Planning staffs in Helsinki and at German headquarters in the north began to consider scenarios for German withdrawal, potential clashes, and the use of scorched earth tactics in Lapland. For civilians, the immediate post-offensive period brought a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Evacuees from the Karelian Isthmus and East Karelia were now dispersed across western and central Finland, living with host families, in temporary housing or in hastily constructed settlements. Authorities organised schooling for evacuated children, employment for adults, and compensation schemes for lost property. Food rationing continued, and imports remained dependent on vulnerable sea routes and political agreements. On the Soviet side, returning administration and reconstruction units took over in Viipuri and East Karelia, beginning the process of restoring transport links, housing and public services in territories that had changed hands more than once since 1939. The end of the offensive also brought the question of prisoners of war and missing personnel into sharper focus. Finnish and Soviet authorities registered thousands of captured soldiers, arranged exchanges of lists through intermediaries, and prepared for eventual repatriation under armistice conditions. Families in both countries awaited news of relatives who had disappeared during the rapid movements of June and July, often receiving only fragmentary information drawn from unit records and eyewitness accounts. Militarily, Finnish headquarters maintained contingency plans in case fighting resumed at higher intensity. Artillery stocks were rebuilt within the limits of industrial capacity and remaining German deliveries. Fortifications were deepened where terrain allowed, and training for replacements continued. Soviet forces on the opposite side of the lines completed the integration of new positions into their wider defensive system, linked the northern end of the front with neighbouring German sectors on the Arctic approaches, and transferred some units to other theatres where operations against Germany were ongoing. By late August, the Karelian offensive had clearly passed from active breakthrough attempts to a state of armed pause. The front in southern Finland remained active but relatively stable. The Finnish army was intact but tied to a compressed defensive line. The Soviet forces had secured key objectives without advancing to Helsinki or demanding immediate occupation. In this situation, the centre of gravity shifted definitively from military operations to diplomatic negotiations, setting the stage for the Finnish delegation's journey to Moscow in September and the armistice agreement that would formalise Finland's withdrawal from the war. The armistice signed in Moscow on 19 September 1944 formalised the outcome that the summer campaign had made possible. Finland accepted restoration of the 1940 frontier with additional territorial changes, including the cession of Petsamo in the north, the permanent loss of the Karelian Isthmus and Ladoga Karelia, and a long-term lease of the Porkkala area near Helsinki as a Soviet naval base. The agreement required significant war reparations to be paid in industrial goods, the demobilization of most of the Finnish army, the legal suppression of organizations deemed fascist, and the prosecution of political leaders held responsible for entering the war. Finland also undertook to expel or disarm German forces on its territory, leading directly to the Lapland War between former co-belligerents. The armistice confirmed that Finland would not be occupied by Soviet forces, although a joint Allied Control Commission dominated by Soviet representatives supervised implementation in Helsinki. The Finnish state retained its institutions, parliament, and a national army of limited size. In the short term, this arrangement reflected a balance. The Soviet Union secured strategic depth around Leningrad and influence over Finnish foreign policy, while accepting that a formerly independent Finland could continue to exist on its northwestern frontier. Militarily, the Karelian offensive demonstrated what a concentrated Soviet operation could achieve against a smaller opponent in 1944. On the Isthmus and in East Karelia, Soviet fronts committed several 100,000 men, thousands of guns and mortars, and large armoured and air components. Over 2 months they advanced to and beyond the 1940 border, captured Viipuri and Petrozavodsk, and forced the Finnish army back onto a shorter line. Soviet casualties in the Vyborg-Petrozavodsk operation ran into the tens of thousands, killed or missing, and well over 100,000 wounded. Finnish losses in killed, wounded and missing were lower in absolute numbers, but very high relative to the country's population and available manpower. For both societies, the campaign left a long-lasting group of veterans and bereaved families. From the Finnish perspective, the summer of 1944 became a central reference point in national memory. The loss of Karelia meant that around 400,000 evacuees, more than 1/10 of the population, had to be resettled permanently inside the new frontiers. Land reform, compensation schemes and housing programs reshaped rural and urban landscapes to absorb them. At the same time, the defensive battles on the VKT line, especially Tali-Ihantala and the Vuoksi, were later presented as the moment when the army preserved the country's independence by preventing a deeper breakthrough. Historians and veterans have debated how far this interpretation reflects battlefield realities and how far it emerged in the political climate of the post-war decades. In Soviet and later Russian narratives, the operation was framed as the final securing of Leningrad and the liberation of territories lost in 1940 to 1941. The emphasis fell on driving Finnish artillery away from the city, eliminating a northern ally of Germany, and restoring control over Karelia and the approaches to the Gulf of Finland. The fact that Soviet forces halted after achieving their declared objectives without advancing on Helsinki was explained in terms of strategic priorities, the need to concentrate resources against Germany, and the willingness to accept a neutral or friendly Finland that conformed to Soviet security requirements. Internationally, the Finnish armistice contributed to the emerging post-war order in Northern Europe. By leaving the war before Germany's final defeat, and by complying with armistice terms, Finland avoided the classification applied to some Axis allies, and retained room for manoeuvre in its later foreign policy. In the Cold War, this translated into a posture of military non-alignment combined with careful accommodation of Soviet interests, sometimes summarized as a policy of neutrality under constraint. The roots of that position lay in the compromises of 1944, a state that had fought alongside Germany but then made a separate peace, accepted reparations and territorial losses, yet was not placed under direct occupation. Economically, the reparations obligations imposed a heavy burden but also influenced the structure of post-war industry. Finland had to deliver ships, machinery, and other products over several years, which required rapid expansion of metalworking, shipbuilding, and engineering sectors. This accelerated a shift from an economy based largely on timber and agriculture toward a more diversified industrial base. At the same time, the permanent loss of Karelia reduced access to certain natural resources and altered trade patterns, particularly in relation to the Soviet Union, which became both a key market and a political factor in economic planning. The campaign also left complex legacies in law and politics. War responsibility trials in Helsinki led to convictions of several leading politicians, including Ryti, under legislation passed after the fact. For some Finns, these proceedings were an imposed condition of the armistice. For others, they represented an attempt to account for decisions that had brought the country into two wars with the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, internal assessments examined the conduct of the Leningrad and Karelian fronts, noting both the effectiveness of artillery and air support and the difficulties encountered when attacking well-organized defenses in difficult terrain. Historiographically, the Karelian offensive has been interpreted through different lenses. Some studies stress the premeditated nature of Stalin's decision not to occupy Finland, arguing that the primary goal was always to secure borders and remove a German partner rather than to impose a new political system. Others highlight the role of Finnish resistance on the VKT line and the Vuoksi, suggesting that the cost of breaking through these positions, combined with commitments on other fronts, encouraged Soviet leaders to accept an armistice once key territorial objectives were gained. Debate continues over the relative weight of these factors, as new archival material and comparative analyses refine casualty figures, operational assessments, and diplomatic records. For individuals who lived through the summer of 1944, the significance of the offensive was defined less by abstract strategy than by concrete experiences: evacuation, bombardment, the destruction and rebuilding of homes, the loss of relatives and comrades, and the transition from total war to an uneasy peace. The Karelian offensive forced a decision that reshaped Finland's borders and its place in Europe, secured the Soviet Union's northwestern approaches, and influenced the balance in the final year of the Second World War. Its legacy lies in the way it combined battlefield outcomes with political calculation, demonstrating how a limited offensive, stopped short of full occupation, could achieve far-reaching strategic and diplomatic results.